oops, I will talk about the review of the biofouling guidelines. So first of all, just a very quick reminder, you must be familiar with the biofouling guidelines and what they are. It is an instrument that is meant to provide a globally consistent approach to biofouling management. It was adopted by the Marine Environment Protection Committee of IMO, the MEPC, in 2011. And the aim, as you can read here, is to minimize the transfer of invasive aquatic species through biofouling. And for that, ships are expected to implement biofouling management practices that are discussed and described in the guidelines. Now, because of the scope of biofouling as an issue, there is a very broad audience for this guidelines. I'm not going to read through it, but you can see that it involves all sorts of players and stakeholders involved to all different stages of ship design, operation, and management. And there are different roles that each stakeholder has to play in biofouling management. Keeping in mind that it's all about ships, as I said, it's important to keep in mind that the definition of ship in the guidelines is very broad, and it includes basically everything that goes into the water, including various types of craft and fixed and floating platforms, FSUs, FPSOs, etc. They are all included in the definition of ship, and therefore the guidelines are relevant for all these various types and sectors. Now, very quickly, I'm going to go through the contents of the guidelines. They address topics ranging from the biofouling management plans and record books that are meant to include details about the procedures and processes that ships may implement for biofouling management. A very important topic, the selection, installation, and maintenance of the anti-fouling systems. And that's something that ships have to be very careful about with the selection and the application and maintenance of the AFS. There is information and content in there about in-water inspection, cleaning, maintenance, and don't forget design and construction of the ship itself, especially with regard to niche areas, because as we will see, they are one of the most important aspects when we are looking at biofouling management, as you already know, the niche areas. There is some other content in the guidelines as well, having to do with the exchange and dissemination of information, training and education, in particular of the ship crews and their awareness on biofouling management and the relevant procedures, and future work and research. And actually this future work and research brings us to how we end up talking about the review of the biofouling guidelines. Because when the guidelines were adopted, it was recognized that they may have to be revisited in the future based on improved information and knowledge. So there is a built-in mechanism for reviewing the guidelines. There is a guidance in this Circular 811 that you see mentioned here. I'm not going to go through the process in detail, but basically it entails collecting information collecting information about the applicability of the guidelines and what can be improved. So based on this procedure, the PPR subcommittee of IMO, that's the Subcommittee on Pollution Prevention and Response, has embarked on a review of the biofouling guidelines, which is meant to be done during the current biennium. So it has just started this year, and that's what I'm going to be updating you about. This guidance contains some performance measures that are used as a basis for reviewing the guidelines. It ranges from identifying what is the level of awareness and dissemination of the guidelines, if there are any impediments to the implementation of the guidelines, if they are used, if there is any visible impact that they have, etc. There is a questionnaire included in the guidance that can be used for collecting this information in a structured way. And of course, the intention is that the findings of such a review would allow the Marine Environment Protection Committee and its subcommittee to determine if there is anything to be done with the guidelines. So during the last session of PPR 7, which was this last February, there was a number of key elements that were identified that require further attention. And again, I'm not going to go through that in detail. You will see a very long list of key elements in these next 2 or 3 or 4 slides. They range from general aspects having to do with the feasibility and the structure and the form of the guidelines, to topics related to the biofouling management plans and record books. It was identified that we need a bit more consistency and some minimum standards and improvements in the form of these documents. At the same time, there was a list of key elements identified in the context of assessing the biofouling present on a hull and especially assessing the management practices that are implemented by ships and companies, how these performance measures that are implemented can be improved, how their efficacy can be assessed so that they can be improved. So all these kind of things were identified as key elements. Last but not least, of course, the niche areas and the in-water cleaning, which are two topics of extremely high importance when it comes to biofouling management. And of course, they are already highlighted in the guidelines. But during the current review, it was identified that they need to be highlighted even further, that a lot more attention needs to be paid into these topics. About the importance of niche areas and what specific things and measures can be implemented in order to deal with biofouling, especially in the niche areas. Also, with regard to in-water cleaning, its importance needs to be highlighted even further. And one thing that was highlighted was the need for consistent standards, and that's something on which work is ongoing at the moment, of course, outside of IMO as well. So in order to progress this exercise, PPR7 established a correspondence group, which works intersessionally. It's currently working at the moment with an aim to report to PPR8. The correspondence group is meant to assess the effectiveness of the guidelines, including the assessment, including the uptake and implementation of the guidelines, to review the guidelines, taking into account latest knowledge on best practices, technologies and techniques, etc. And that's the crux of it, is to develop recommendations on how to address the issues identified in the key elements that I talked about in the previous slides, how to address these key elements in the biofouling guidelines, obviously most likely by revising the guidelines in order to improve the effectiveness of the guidelines and therefore increase the uptake. So this correspondence group has just basically concluded the first part of its work and has submitted its report. And it's the findings of the group as captured in this report that I'm going to talk about in the next few slides. Here is just a list of the delegations that are taking part in the correspondence group. Of course, don't forget, for those of you that are maybe not too familiar with IMO processes, let's keep in mind that IMO is a UN agency. It's an intergovernmental organization, which means that work like this is not done by individuals in any private capacity. All the work in IMO is done by delegations. So it's delegations that participate in the correspondence group. And that's mostly, of course, member states. And you can see here the flags of the 19 member states that are at the moment participating in the correspondence group. Also, one intergovernmental organization, ICES, the International Council on the Exploration of the Seas, is taking part, as well as a few NGOs representing shipyard, the shipping industry. You see there BIMCO, CLIA, and ICS. Also, the International Harbor Masters Association, IMAREST and RINA, technical professional associations, and WCC representing the paint industry. So all these various delegations have been taking part in the correspondence group. And let's look at what are the main findings of the correspondence group following its work so far. It was identified that the focus for approaching biofouling management in a risk-based manner has to be the operating profile of the ship and also the operating profile and the characteristics of the anti-fouling system. The next one is that it was agreed, or it was recommended, let's say, by the group that there should be a bit more structure in terms of the format and the content of inspection and cleaning reports and records of maintenance of anti-fouling systems. The next one is about acknowledging that the guidelines are voluntary, which means that if we define acceptable levels of biofouling, they can only be in the form of recommendation and nothing prescriptive. Actually, this concept of not being too prescriptive. It's something that you will see it's ever present. It's ubiquitous in these main findings. You will see it coming up in several more. Now, the next one here is that we should identify a level of biofouling that could be used as a basis for inspection and to identify if something further is required, like cleaning or other biofouling management options. With regard to the frequency cleaning, again, we are coming to this principle of not being prescriptive. It was agreed that the guidelines should highlight the principle that the frequency of cleaning should be based on the operational profile of the ship, but the guidelines should not recommend specific cleaning frequencies. They should be defined for each ship based on its operating profile. Similarly, that the guidelines should not propose specific acceptable cleaning methods, but should define a goal-based, let's say, outcome for cleaning operations, and then the selection of the specific method should be up to the ship and the operator. It was recommended that there should be more details in the guidelines on how the cleaning should be documented. And also another important topic is the handling of biological waste, which should be captured or disposed of in an environmentally sound manner, but again, not in any prescriptive way in the guidelines, because that's up to the requirements of each jurisdiction where the cleaning takes place, and the guidelines should only highlight these points, but not include specific proposed methods or mandate anything. With regard to the anti-fouling systems, again, the same principle that the guidelines should not include detailed technical specification or guidance on anti-fouling systems, because that should be dependent on the profile of the ship and should be done in accordance with the guidance by the manufacturer of the anti-fouling systems. However, it was identified that the AFS manufacturer should be encouraged, and of course I highlight encouraged, nothing beyond that, to provide details that the ship and the company can include in the biofouling management plan regarding the maintenance and the effectiveness of the anti-fouling system. The last point on this slide is that the guidelines and the appendices of the guidelines that are relating to the documents like the biofouling management plans and record books should not be generic and should be a bit more specific, more structured, more user-friendly, and include information that could actually lead to the updating of the biofouling management plan itself. And the last bit here, in terms of the main findings, is that it was recommended that there should be some general guidance on the assessment of the biofouling management practices, as I said before, which was identified as a key element. And there was broad support in the correspondence group that all countries should take action to increase the uptake and the effectiveness of the guidelines. And that includes addressing feasibility issues such as the availability of in-water cleaning facilities. The last point here is that the guidelines should be restructured. That's the bottom line of all this work in the correspondence group, that there should be a restructuring of the guidelines to increase its uptake and effectiveness, make the guidelines clearer, less general, include user-specific guidance, and allocate responsibilities for the various stakeholders, which is at the moment not done so clearly in the current version. And another point here that is not present at the moment, which is to reflect the chronological sequence from ship design up to the end of the service life of the ship. So based on all this, what has happened at the moment is that the correspondence group has prepared a draft skeleton for a revised version of the biofouling guidelines. Of course, that's a skeleton. There's no content there yet. It's a proposed revised structure of the guidelines that, of course, has to be agreed by PPR 8 so that it can be progressed further. But in the meantime, in the interest of time, and given that PPR 8 at the moment, we don't know where it's going to be scheduled because of COVID and all the impact on the IMO schedule of meetings, the correspondence group is continuing its work by revising the guidelines based on the draft skeleton. So the correspondence group is embarking now in the next phase of work of actually populating this proposed draft revised skeleton. That is done building on the main findings of the correspondence group that I talked about in the previous 3 or 4 slides, and taking into account information and comments, input that was provided on specific issues by the various delegations that contributed into this process. It is proposed that the correspondence group should be re-established after PPR8 in order to progress the work. Of course, at the moment, as I said, PPR8 is in a sort of limbo. We don't know when it's actually going to take place. So in the meantime, while we're waiting for that, the correspondence group is already continuing its work. And once PPR8 is rescheduled and takes place, then this procedure will continue more formally. But that's where the review of the guideline stands at the moment. And that was the end of my presentation.